And so going into the next part of the article that caught my attention, unfortunately, these arguments contain bad economic reasoning that leads to overstatement of the benefits of stadiums. Economic growth takes place when a community's resources, people, capital investments, and natural resources like land become more productive. Increased productivity can arise in two ways: from economically beneficial specialization by the community for the purpose of trading with other regions, or from local value added that is higher than other uses of local workers, land, and investments. Building a stadium is good for the local economy only if a stadium is the most productive way to make capital investments and use its workers. And I just really think that this is very important to keep in mind, because I know a lot of individuals, especially if you think of civics, a lot of individuals want to run for office and want to make a change in the community. But when you run for office, one of the primary things you're going to be doing is setting budgets and looking at dollars. And if you are not financially literate, cannot be aware of finance, cannot be aware of things like capital investments, land use, best land use, I don't think you're ready to represent the people, because you could be a good person and charming and likable, but when it comes to certain things that affect the decisions of your city or your district or the overall structure of it, and you're not financially literate, and you're not open to the economic and community development processes that go within making 20 to 30-year decisions, you definitely don't want to put yourself in a position to be a candidate to run for office. And I'm speaking for myself and just speaking to myself in regards to that. And so ultimately, bad economic reasoning that leads to an overstatement of the benefits of stadiums. Economic growth takes place when community resources are invested in, community resources like people, capital investment, and natural resources like land to become more productive. And it also boils down to what they would say higher uses of local workers, land, and investments. And so the argument might be said here that stadiums are great, but there could be higher uses for land, for workers, and investments other than a stadium. So one thing that comes to my mind with this is, so what do cities or professional brands look for when they're looking to develop or expand a stadium, and how does that not only benefit them, obviously we know it's going to be profitable, but also how does that benefit the people that reside and live, work, and play in those areas where you're developing the land? And that's why this Brookings Institute or this Brookings report caught my attention. Just something for you to read. And the goal is to make sure that that report is available for you to check out in the description. But outside of that, jumping back into the new stadium plan, what this plan means for Metro and Nashville residents. We're going to talk a little more about the existing stadium lease and how it is transforming or transferring over to the new stadium lease, and what this transfer means for Metro and Nashville residents. Let's see here. The current Nissan stadium lease, and shout out to Nissan, obviously investing in the stadium and being a part of this move naturally. The current Nissan stadium lease requires Metro to pay $1.75 to $1.95 billion in maintenance and upgrades through 2039. So that's really, as they put it, obligated to fund the stadium upgrades and maintenance to 2039. That's a very long commitment, and you're paying close to $2 billion in maintenance and upgrades through 2039. I'm very fortunate to know, at least you know what the numbers are. But I can see at that time when the existing stadium lease was being developed and proposed, and there was a lot of community engagement, I can hear a lot of the residents not necessarily being too fond of being stuck with a $2 billion bill. And I'm not sure but I know a lot of the conversations now in the rural areas that I'm helping to assist with community engagement between residents, groups, and developers, public agencies, is the maintenance, the upgrade, and what is the best use of the land. And yeah, $2 billion in maintenance and upgrades. to 2039. It's a big deal. And how does that play in, now you're paying $2 billion in maintenance and upgrades, but does that growth just affect the downtown corridor? And I do want to shout out downtown Nashville partnership, Nashville Downtown Partnership. It is I'm going to use the word special interest group, but probably a bad choice of words. I'm not sure if it's a for-profit or non-profit, but it's a interest group that I believe was started in like the 70s or 80s, when the local businesses in downtown Nashville decided to put their money together and utilize and take advantage of a federal opportunity where if the local businesses in a coalition or corridor put up a certain amount of money, the federal government, at the minimum, I believe, at the state, would also match the funds to revitalize a business district. And that's what the Nashville Downtown Partnership did to some degree, and took that subsidized federal money, I think it was state money as well, I'm not too quite sure, and made it into what Nashville Downtown is today. They now have an interest in the Gulch area, which I believe was South Nashville. And I know there's a lot of history of African Americans in South Nashville, to include where a lot of African Americans ended up settling after the Civil War. So I'm not speaking out of ignorance, due to Fort Negley and all that historic situation there, respectfully I say. And so ultimately, I just would like to see how that at the time, the $2 billion bill that the city's residents received, how did they take that back then? And did that growth or revenue or risk also reward the outskirts of Nashville and the metro Nashville area? Or was that revenue concentrated in the downtown area? Obviously, tourism, spending, businesses coming through, all those things are good for that urban core area, but how did that affect, if at all, the outskirts? And that's coming from what this means for Metro Nashville. The new lease eliminates that burden, and Metro will pay $0 from the operating budget for a new stadium. So that's great. And I'm not sure if that deal could have been made back then. I'd love to have been at the table just to see what was being talked about and how that process works. And I know I'll be there soon. But ultimately, anytime you're not having to pay anything as far as operating bill is a good look. And again, I'm watching Yellowstone. There are, and reading Brookings, there are situations where your local and your state governments, federal governments, are subsidizing investment opportunities. And there's pros and cons in that. And so Titans also agreed to return valuable land. Now, I'm glad that's highlighted. Titans agreed to return valuable land to the city that the team currently controls until 2039. So if you look at some of the bolds of what we've read as far as bullet points so far, you got paying $2 billion in maintenance and upgrades. You got a burden. This is what was at one point, what the taxpayer was going to receive. $2 billion in maintenance and upgrades, burden, and paying dollars for an operating budget, and losing valuable land. So I can see that being a challenge, to where now that investment has transpired to, doesn't look like the city is overseeing maintenance and upgrades. Obviously, with eliminations of burdens, paying $0 in operating expenses, and returning valuable land to the city that has been controlled until 2039. And that's where you look at the best land use. And so now you got a city that ultimately is winning from this investment, because now the money's coming in, the traffic's coming in, Nashville's hot, a lot of things have been moved. And again, these ideas and policies and practices and approaches sometimes are 10, 20, 30 years thought out and being pursued well in advance to where it is today. And so moving on in that, keeping that in mind, especially returning valuable land, Metro, next bullet point, Metro will transform that land into a mixed income neighborhood with housing, parks, green space, and critical city infrastructure. And I wanted to bring this up especially because my experience with urban core development, real estate, and my firm having real estate developers outsource the community engagement aspect and marketing to my firm to bring residents and community groups to community meetings that relate to a real estate development project that's happening in an urban communities area. That makes sense. So there's a real estate developer or project going on in a particular urban community. The developers have to get a certain amount of community meetings going to prove that the community's bought in at the minimum, even though it's a board of aldermen or a city council vote. Either way, you still got to have those meetings and show that they are meetings where people are bought in, more importantly, if at all. And my firm has had a chance to have those community meetings outsourced to us by various real estate development firms. And our job was to bring traffic to the meeting so that these developers can continue on with the development process and get a yay or nay vote from the Metro Council or Board of Aldermen, depending on the type of city and county and area you live in. Metro Council and the Board of Aldermen are pretty much the same thing, just different titles. And it just depends on if you're living in a town, municipality, small city, all those things. And just my experience, I'm speaking on how, one, my experience of having these so many different community meetings outsourced to us, but for on behalf of developers, has shaped what they call communities when it comes to housing, parks, green space, and critical city infrastructure, but also just getting to know and learn more about mixed income neighborhoods and being a part of that process. Also have an opportunity to serve as a community advisor for Choice Nashville. I think that's how you, for Choice Neighborhoods, Choice Neighborhoods, which is a community advisory council for the Suticum Napier neighborhood transformation, where that particular body is that public site is transforming from a public housing site to a mixed income neighborhood, and that drastically changes the income status, the class, if you will, of those neighborhoods, simply because public housing is usually based on income, mixed income. The majority of the units are market rate, with a portion, usually roughly 10% or so, of the units being based on income or low income housing. And so you have a public housing site housing sometimes up to 200 families that will have to relocate to somewhere else, basically because only 10% at best of the population that currently lives there will stay. And that's simply because back in the 60s, 70s, I believe, worst case 80s, the federal government had a program in which developers could receive a tax incentive for building public housing sites. And that tax incentive was good for about 30 years. And again, this is about the 70s, 80s, maybe the 60s. And we're going 30 years now. You have cities that are really booming now. And those tax incentivized public housing sites no longer have to be honored. And it makes sense, especially in booming cities that may not have been booming 30, 20 years ago, to go ahead and push market rate leases to maximize their profits, especially when the government was paying them subsidy, but at the same time, you can get probably twice or three times more of that at market value if you go to the private sector side. And so is that by coincidence? Who knows? But those 30 years of public housing to bring in income for developers is now transforming to market value, mixed income neighborhoods, developments in which, a lot of things are changing. And I wanted to break that down because, again, now you're returning valuable land to the city. But like we read in the Brookings report, it's about the best land use. And was a stadium good? Or, and that makes me think, okay, well, what is the best land use for land? And so for that reason, went on ahead and looked into the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. It's an article that discusses the effects of land development on municipal finance, a conceptual overview by Kurt Paulson back in 2009, September. And the reason I'm bringing this up again is because, again, I like these older looking or older written articles and content because it gives us a chance to really look at what they felt the vision and what was possible to where it actually happened and what we're seeing and experiencing. And ultimately, again, as I have an opportunity to serve as a community engagement outsource for real estate developers, urban core developers, and being in the middle of these conversations for community buy-in, I'm seeing where in rural areas now, farmers or those that are more agriculturally minded are pushing back or advocating more for, hey, we don't have to take all this farmland or open land and transform it into commercial residential development, and in the long run, studies show, I'm not saying it's true or not, but I'm in these conversations, watching and learning. So it's great because it provides more value to my clients and also provides more value and insights to those that are in the community residence, community engagement, community organization side, for them to have a better pitch or to be aware of, what the real conversation is, so they can really look out and have an educated conversation about, the best outcomes for their community, because I know that's what you're looking to do. But ultimately, actual residents and advocates saying, hey, you're losing money when you create these developments based upon maintenance, upgrades. You saw what was going on with the Titan Stadium for 2039. How does that continue to do? Now, property taxes does bring in revenue, but there are certain situations that can affect property taxes and certain climates that don't necessarily, if things aren't good, bring in the revenue that the city needs. And also, you're taking on more debt. So if things don't go smooth, guess what? You're still losing. So that's what the Titans kind of did from their existing lease to the new lease. They took on a risk of, and that was really backed by the city and the residents, but everything in its 30-year plan went according to the best outcome, to where at least it's perceived right now that it makes sense to actually in Nashville to go ahead and revitalize your stadium and make it Super Bowl proof. So now you can do everything that the NFL can offer at your stadium and bring in tourism, bring in more spending. And because now I believe the stadium is going to be approved to actually be developed to be Super Bowl ready. So you can actually host a Super Bowl at the stadium, which right now the stadium is not in compliance, and the hotel space and all that was not in compliance. But all that is changed through growth. And that's why I wanted to shout out the Nashville Convention and Visitors Corporation, with Spiridon. There's a lot of moving parts, but people are trying their best to survive as individuals and people and professionals. And also with your creativity, how can you actually, do your job well? And there's a lot of sensitive situations, but I do respect what Visit Music City is doing an outstanding job, and bringing it back again, the effects of development of municipal finance. And it boils down to municipal finance at the local and the minimum level. That's why I'm advocating to those that are looking to run for office. Make sure you have your finance, because if I'm going to vote for you, I need to look at your finance. And I need to see the structure of your livelihood and your home, and how sound are those things, your personal behind the scene, before I sit here and look at your public charm, respectfully. And I think that's what we all have to do. That's why I'm not really I'm not a politician, or I don't advocate to be, but I find myself in those positions, and I really pray for our elected officials of every capacity, because you're literally taking on a personal form and transforming that into a public property, if you will. And you will take the yays and successes and the nays and the failures of your department and agency in that elected official position. And sometimes there's just no win-win. Even though we're looking for a win-win deal, sometimes there is not. And then maybe there's not going to be an immediate win-win, but maybe the long term. But people don't look down the road. They look for the short term, respectfully. And, that's a lot, So ultimately, keeping those things in mind, going into the article, the purpose of this paper that was written is to provide a theoretical and conceptual understanding of the fiscal effects which might be expected to result from land development within the community. The paper begins with a description of an initial equilibrium within a community prior to land development in order to exposit the mechanisms by which local government revenues and expenditures are determined. Understanding and predicting the effects of land development on municipal revenues and expenditures begins with an understanding of how levels of public expenditures are determined in the complex interaction between demand for public services and the production function, which translates public inputs and outputs into levels of service outcomes experienced by voters and residents. The paper then traces the effects of land developments through the system, discussing assumption about service demand, service production, and the effects of social, economic, and demographic characteristics of both demand and cost. This paper identifies that the direct fiscal impacts, which are measures in most fiscal impact analysis techniques, are only a subset of types of fiscal impacts that will be expected to result from land development within a community. To the basic ear, what the heck was that? What the heck did I just say? And this is why I really want people to say, or that think that they want or inspired to run as a candidate. You're talking to this jargon. If you want to be the best for your representative for your district, you got to have this jargon. You have to have this mindset. You have to have this experience at the minimum. Dealing with direct fiscal impact. Like if I were to sit here and say, if you were running for office and I happen to stop by and come to a town hall or a Q&A, I'm asking you about, what's your thoughts on the fiscal impact analysis technique, or the direct fiscal impact, or social, economic, demographic and demographic characteristics of both demand and cost. These things, public input, levels of service outcome experienced by voters and residents, land development, just some of these key words, municipal revenues and expenditures. These are key words that we have to keep in mind, and these are key thinking points that developers have to keep in mind in order for their success, their project to be a success, and for new stadiums at the minimum to be developed. And this is the mindset that everyone has to be on if you're a non-developer, because this is the mindset that they are on. And so this paper ultimately is to discuss, what is fair to land development for the community prior to this land being developed, and what revenues and expenses are going to be determined. So you have land, what are going to be the revenues and expenses projected, and how is this going to best affect the community and use of the land at the minimum, and best use of our workers. These are all things that you got to think about, and that developers are always trying to keep in mind. And so looking at that, as far as Metro will transform the land into a mixed income neighborhood within housing, with housing, parks, green space, and critical city infrastructure, I want to go ahead and see if I can leave a link to a shadow opportunity that I did with Metro Housing Development Agency in Nashville. And they were traveling around looking at affordable housing and mixed income housing, and looking at designs and things of that nature, because I believe there's no longer any public housing in Nashville at this point. Everything's transforming into mixed income, and it makes sense for Nashville to do the same at the minimum with their land use, being that the land is so valuable. But at the same time, I want to jump into, what does land, best use of land look like? What are our options, in that type of conversation?